Hi again, welcome back to part two on I'm Thinking of My Father. In this session, I guess sort of three main things we're looking at. How you can get a lot out of one detail, and we look particularly at the symbol of the fire in part one. So thinking about the different possible meanings and relevances that one detail can have. Secondly, the idea of linking a symbol or an image to how it is used elsewhere. You don't explicitly necessarily mention the other poem, but talking about how this symbol has been used here in a particular way, and elsewhere it might be used in a different way. And we used again the example of the fire, comparing to the way it's used very differently and much more positively. I think it's fair to say in those winter Sundays. And the third thing I want to sort of look at, which links to those, is the idea of the importance of your interpretation. And we touched on that really in part one, because at the end I went through those different interpretations of the symbol of the fire. And whilst lots of them overlapped and had things in common, they were all particular. And that was a sample as well. There are others that didn't have space or time to include. So the examiner is looking for your particular interpretation, which you can back up by saying what details and images meant to you. And reading in general away from exams is about that too. A good poem means different things to different people. And while the writer may have intentions around what meaning she wants to put across, ultimately the meaning is created not just in the act of writing, but in the act of reading and in the context that you bring to the poem. So we'll look a little bit more at that in part two by picking out a few other details that people commented on in this poem. So here's the first couple of stanzas. And I've highlighted in the first stanza more wood on the fire in line 2, and then again in line 4 he's throwing more wood on the fire. So already we have more wood repeated 2 or 3 times, depending how you want to take that. 3 mores anyway, and we've got fire repeated twice. And a few people commented or asked about why is this image of the fire repeated again and again. Well, partly it's its importance and centrality to the meaning of the poem. We looked at that in part 1. A couple of people suggested, and I like the suggestion, that keep on repeating the fire gives this idea of it getting sort of out of control and getting bigger and bigger, the way perhaps a feeling can if it's not properly dealt with. We see that repetition continue throughout the poem. So we looked at stanza 1, but if we look at stanza 3, we have fire twice more, and he's throwing wood on the fire twice more. The fire is getting higher, both at the beginning and the end of stanza 4. The fire, we're expecting the fire to falter here, but actually it keeps on flickering, and it's only in the very last line of the poem that the father stops throwing wood on the fire. So this repetition of the fire again and again, even if in this stanza the fire actually is defeated by something else, and we'll look at that a little bit more shortly. So there is only actually one stanza in the whole poem that doesn't mention this fire, and it's the second one. And I guess that's quite interesting in the sense that if the father is building up this fire as a displacement activity, as a distraction to deny the reality of what's happening to his brother, this stanza suggests it doesn't work, because the fire is taking up all the space in the poem and perhaps all the space in his life. There's no space in the daughter. She may be speaking the words of the poem, but she doesn't actually appear. There's little space for his wife. She appears in one line here, but it might displace everything else. But the one thing the fire can't displace is this fact about his brother and the tumour that is growing in his brother. So it doesn't actually work to displace that sadness or grief or anger or whatever that emotion might be that he's trying to feed into the fire and burn up in this way. One person picked out the last line of that stanza too as the key line: a tumour the size of a fist and growing. That touches a little bit on what another student mentioned when we were looking at the fire in part 1. Here's something that's both literal and metaphorical at the same time. and that's why it's an effective line. The tumour probably is the size of a fist, so it's a description. We can picture the reality of that issue in the uncle's body. But of course, by using fist, it brings in all those connotations of violence, being attacked, pain, all of which this feels like an assault. The uncle's cancer is an assault, an attack on the family, an act of violence, which goes to explain the anger and grief of the father. So another example of that phenomenon, which is a useful one, I think, maybe to comment on in an exam and to look out for in your reading generally, of a word or a phrase working literally and metaphorically at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Okay, a couple of people picked out the cherry blossom tree. I wasn't sure about cherry blossom tree, but I had a feeling it was to do with spring, because of that's the time of the year when we see blossom, and particularly the cherry blossom, and that is the case. Cherry blossom is used in lots of cultures, particularly in Japan, but also in European cultures, as a symbol of spring and renewal. So that could be seen as a positive amongst a poem that has lots of sort of dark imagery and describes dark events. But also, maybe there's something fatalistic and less positive about that. You know, fitting in with what some students mentioned about the fire, that it's life, but eventually it's going to go out, it's going to fade away, it's going to be burnt up. And the world carries on. This father is consumed by his feelings, which then become this raging fire. But the cherry blossom is waiting to grow. Spring's going to come. New life is going to start. So the world carries on without caring about these human emotions. So spring is often a sign of hope. We talked about that in the Simon Armitage poem about lockdown. But here perhaps spring could be seen as a sign of indifference, something darker, I think. The mother's sitting and watching the TV, like we said before. It's interesting, we only see her in just this one line. Something perhaps for us to come back to, but you might just think now, how should we respond to that? What should we think about the mother based on just that one line? Okay, a few people picked out the detail of the saw that screams as if someone is dying. Of course, someone is dying, so the as if is interesting there. Almost like maybe the poet is saying, yeah, it's right that the saw is screaming. Or the poet imagines her father thinking, I want to make this saw scream. I want something outside of me to acknowledge what I'm going through and what my brother is going through. So the personification of the saw. There's a lot of personification in this poem. The saw is screaming here. The cherry blossom is waiting in the previous stanza. The ending has a face in the last stanza. And actually the gnomes are obviously statues of people or beings, but they come to life. So lots of personification. Almost that everything around the father has some sort of will of its own, some sort of feeling of its own, whereas he, in a way, although this fire is an embodiment in some people's eyes of his emotions, maybe he's numb as well, in a sense. So the saw is screaming because he can't. Those feelings are coming out elsewhere. And other things have this sort of personification because they have power, and he's totally powerless. So one person made a connection, doing that thing about linking images to what you've seen in another reading, to bayonet charge. Remember that rifle, numb as a smashed arm. The rifle was an extension, if you like, of the soldier. Well, here the saw is an extension of the father. He's numb to everything. And that comes across in this idea. He doesn't care about splinters or safety. He's not bothered about anything else almost except this fire, which was touched on in some of the student responses we looked at in part 1. There's another take on that one student said he's unaware of the pain that he's causing to other people. The splinters might be the effect he's having on his wife or his daughter by being so consumed by his own feelings. He stopped caring about those around him. He only cares about this fire. and whatever this fire represents. Okay, last two stanzas. So, grave little gnomes in their cheerful red breeches. Well, grave's an interesting little adjective, isn't it, with obvious connotations. And yet, the gnomes might be grave, but they're also cheerful. One student suggested, and I like the suggestion, that these cheerful gnomes, these little model people who aren't real, are maybe representative of a false happiness. And thought, yeah, good point, because we've got this lawn as well that sits in its shadows and dark in its falsehoods. There's that word falsehood, which links the two together. And the lawn, if you like, is something that's cultivated. It is not nature really, or it's nature cut into a human shape. It's for the family, and then it's decorated with these gnomes. Almost like the gnomes and the lawn might represent a false image, a facade of happiness, whereas in reality, well, we see the reality. That falls away a little bit, doesn't it, in this poem? Because rather than this false happiness of the family unit, there's no happiness in this family unit. There's only this fire, which is the sadness and the anger of the situation. So, some excellent interpretations there of those lines. I don't want to dwell too much on the details of the poem. There's others that you could pick out, but we're short of time, and in the exam you'll be short of time. So one thing maybe to come out of this poem is that actually just one image might do you. The image of the fire could actually support a whole answer about the feelings of the father in the poem. Okay, a few more questions just on the screen that people asked. So, why has the writer chosen to write about the father in this light? What was their original intent for this? Well, sometimes we'll study a poem by someone who's long dead. We can't ask them. Kim Moore's alive and well, and she's online. You could email and ask her. But the point is, I think it's more interesting actually to say, what does the poem mean to you? And as we saw in part one, it means different things to different people. So I know Kim Moore's written several poems about her father, which are certainly autobiographical. Is this one autobiographical as well? And what's she getting at? Well, that might be interesting, but I don't think it's as interesting as what you think about the poem. So talking a bit more about that, is the uncle dead at the end? Well, we don't know. Like all good poems, there's a space for our interpretation. I would say, yeah, probably, yeah. The fire dies down. That's a sort of symbolic of the fact that maybe hope has been lost, or the father has accepted what's going to happen. But of course, it might not be that the uncle's dead. It might be that he's come to his senses and said, I'm no longer going to spend all my time throwing my pain into this fire. I'm going to do something actually useful and go and see my brother while I still can. And then another student said, is the father dead at the end? And I said to myself, no, I don't think so. But then I thought, I said, well, maybe. Because that wasn't my reading of the poem, but it is a reading of the poem that could be supported. If the fire is a symbol of life and the fire dies away, and if the speaker says, I'm thinking of my father, maybe we get this image of the uncle, but the fire in a symbolic way is not just that one moment in the father's life, but his whole life. And at the end that fire dies away, and the poem has something to say about the shortness of life. So there is a sense in which that would make sense. The father has passed away, the speaker is thinking of her father, and starts off by thinking of this one moment connected to the uncle, but then that sort of spaces out into the father's whole life. So I'd never thought that before about this poem when I've read it in the past, but I could see where that student was coming from. And that speaks to the idea of the validity of your response, as long as you can back it up. One more question on the screen. Is it partly about masculinity? Well, a couple of you made interesting points about this. The idea that how does he deal with his grief with stereotypically masculine things, a saw, a fire, rather than being able to talk about his feelings and maybe deal with them more successfully. So I think, yes, there is a sense in which that's the case in this poem. Okay, we're coming to the end now. I'll look forward to seeing some of you next week. Until then, take care. I'll see you later.